Good evening, everyone. As you can see, this is the opposite of a manel. So well done, ORF. And Kanishk, don't feel out of place. I think a lot of times it's the other way around for women on the panel. So, all right, we're here to discuss something very, very fascinating, something very, very important, something very, very critical, and that is how much has changed since the Christchurch call to action. And the first real test was already before the world, just a few days ago, when you had a neo-Nazi shoot two people in front of a synagogue in Germany just a few days ago. I'm sure all of you were familiar with what happened. Much like what happened in Christchurch when mosques were the target of attack, and here it was a synagogue, this too was attempted to be live streamed. But there was a marked difference in how technology companies were able to come together this time compared to what happened in Christchurch when perhaps there was no synergy between the big tech companies and the world was somewhat unprepared. And what we saw was that the platform on which the synagogue attack was live streamed, called Twitch, for 30 minutes the live streaming did take place. 2,200 people watched this attack taking place, but very quickly the Global Internet Forum was able to share information and take this video down and ensure that it wasn't edited, downloaded, and then shared on at least the big platforms. Now, it's almost impossible to erase something totally from the internet, this we know, but I think this was an example of what can be done. Yet we're confronted with very complex questions, because may I remind everybody in this hall that the Christchurch call to action also talks about the internet remaining free while remaining secure. So it's not security at the cost of freedom. It's arguing that both are possible. And two, it actually talks about the need for offline action to supplement what's happening online. So a really important discussion that's taking place here. And I'll start with Anki Das, who's the head of public policy for Facebook in India, South Asia, and Central Asia. Anki, what has been the learning? We saw what happened with the synagogue live streaming that took place in Germany, but it hasn't really resolved all the questions and all the dilemmas about whether what is now called dangerous and violent content can actually be removed totally from the internet.
What's changed between Christchurch and the incident in Germany is the global coalition has got its act together. This is, I think, the first implementation at a large scale of what was designed as a part of the GIFCT coalition, which is a global internet forum for counterterrorism. As part of that, a content incident protocol was created, which essentially meant that participating companies would flag to their members when such an incident were to happen, so that there would be appropriate activation of content takedown and disabling, as well as banking of that piece of content in terms of the hashes databases. As you know, the GIFCT has as its constituent members Facebook, of course, but also other companies like Google, Twitter, and Microsoft, and very recently, Dropbox and Pinterest have also joined the coalition. So there is an expansion of the membership of the GIFCT. And I think there is, this particularly demonstrates that there is a case for smaller internet firms also to become part of this coalition, because if the membership grows, it basically creates a sharing loop, and which makes enforcement on the platform easier. Because you could imagine this, that there are billions and billions of pieces of content which are getting shared on the internet. Yeah. And if the power of partnerships is not unleashed clearly, this would be problematic. And in a sense, if you look at it, the multilateral framework, in a sense, which has emerged, which is a Christchurch call to action, which initially had 17 UN member states as signatories, but now it's expanded to over 31, I think, essentially agreeing to a set of rules in terms of working with governments, but also very tangible cause of action for the private sector in terms of working together to really strengthen the hashes database and make sure that this banking of images is strictly enforced on the platforms.
So would you say one thing, of course, that's happening, speaking from a technology point of view, is, for example, this live stream video of the synagogue attack was very quickly using what's called a hash, and which is kind of like a print that is recognizable by all of these big tech companies. And so you were all able to take it off. But would you say the main challenge is that smaller companies remain outside of this global internet forum?
I think it creates a model in terms of speedy enforcement, because when bad content spreads virally, you want to be able to act on scale, right? And what happens is that when bad actors come to know that there's going to be hostility to them on platforms who are going to be enforcing against this, they will try and find other platforms where they can spread this content, right? As smaller platforms also see that this kind of burden is shifting on their platforms, I think they will recognize the natural incentives to switch and become members of the GIFCD type of forums. We also, as GIFCD, and Facebook has a chair for GIFCD this year, we've been advocating a lot broadly within our industry and within our community, amongst the tech community, amongst the technical community, the benefits of becoming part of this coalition.
Now, Kanishk, let me bring you in here. You specifically study disinformation. And since we do live in an age of fake news, we live in an age of, as Anki was saying, where bad content can actually acquire virality very soon, and lies and falsehoods can also travel very quickly. And you in particular look at the far right or alt-right extremist groups that are using this disinformation, are almost weaponizing disinformation. What are some of the challenges you're finding after the Christchurch call to action, kind of black holes where we don't have the information?
Yeah, so internet creates social values, but by its decentralized design, it also creates opportunities for people to engage in hateful activities. It's designed to protect speech. So regardless of a lot of platforms delete these contents, we've seen content growing like mushrooms in shaded sides or dark sides of the internet. When we talk about the dark sides of internet, we talk about small platforms like 8chan, 4chan, or even hosting their own websites to put out these content. Now there comes another concern of disinformation. For instance, the Christchurch incident was, for platforms, it became a challenge when users realized that platforms are cracking these videos. What people did was they started to frame the captions or the video as a first-person gaming shooting video. So we see how people are using ways to manipulate and send out the same message across. And the level of this sophistication and changes in tactics have been developing after the incident. And also, for instance, in the Christchurch incident, the shooter posted his own manifesto online for people to view. And that manifesto was basically translated in a lot of languages. Bellingcat, our co-team, found out that they found 15 translated versions of the same text posted in different groups, spreading the same sort of disinformation and influence operations within that manifesto. And when you're talking about these large-scale translations and moving of these manifestos across platforms, then it becomes way more challenging for platforms to deal with the same content.
So let me pick up one of those challenges, and I'll take that to Mariam, if I may, because I think that while the Christchurch attacks and the synagogue attack are very clear examples on which there can be no two opinions, and there is a global consensus, there is consensus even among the tech companies, the country, your country, Afghanistan, there's a very interesting shift that will take place maybe soon, where the Taliban, after having been ousted, may well return to government and to leading the country. And I'm intrigued to know what happens in that gray zone where what was once considered inflammatory, dangerous content can get mainstreamed, can become part of political power. How should tech companies, how should civil society respond in that case?
Well, allow me to provide some information. So the Taliban were completely against using any form of media, whether it was television, radio, and now all of a sudden they're more savvier on using social media than the Afghan government is. We have 35 plus million population in Afghanistan, and of the 35 plus million, 9.7 million have access to the internet, and 3.8 million are social media active users. Most of the recruitment that happens from Taliban are online. Now that the conversation has shifted, unfortunately, from the beginning, especially since Christchurch, Afghanistan has never come on board, the government has never come on board to actually monitor and put rules and regulation for content. We are a country that has terrorist organizations. We have ISIS, we have other regional and international terrorist groups, and then we have the Afghan Taliban, who were national terrorists, and now they're, the term is strong, violent political opposition. I don't think the civil society in Afghanistan could be much effective because the civil society is an extension of the government. But I think that the public, the general social media users, not only in Afghanistan, but I find the region is really important here, to provide recommendations on how to move forward and how to monitor such things. Violent content, disinformation, and trolling has become very common in Afghanistan. We have very weak cyber troops in Afghanistan. Actually, we don't even give it any relevance. And I think that we need to start being more effective in this sense because this is what perpetrates violence. The political maturity is not where it should be. I think that now, okay, so the Taliban are not yet in power, so before everybody gets swayed to the other side, there's still certain levels of engagements going on with the United States, but the Afghan government has not engaged with them. Now, when the Afghan government engages with them, whether they're going to engage with them directly or they're going to engage with them as civilians, because the Taliban have made it very clear that they're not going to communicate with the Afghan government. That is why I'm saying that this has to be a citizens' act moving forward. Citizens have to come up with rules and regulations. And we have a major concern here because the citizens are the one who are misusing social media in Afghanistan. So the question is, what do you do then?
Interesting question. Before I take this to Sumaya and Victoria, Anki, India's National Security Advisor, Mr. Doval, speaking today at a function of anti-terror squad chiefs, made the point about the linkages between publicity and terrorism. And there is an assumption, even at the heart of the Christchurch call to action, that if you take away publicity, if you take away amplification from terrorism, something could change. Could you speak about the experience in the aftermath of the Pulwama terror attack that really, in a sense, shifted the discourse here in India?
No, that's a very fair point in terms of, sort of propaganda tools, right? Anything which has communicative power will lend itself for purposes of propaganda. Propaganda can be both positive and negative, and we've seen that in the case of terrorist attacks. But what is very compelling and what is very interesting to note, when you look at the data, in terms of the hash sharing coalition's data, in terms of the kind of enforcement which has been done, over 85.5% of the content which has been banked and taken down essentially are glorification of terrorist acts. So of course you can argue that these tools and platforms are used for recruitment purposes and for radicalization and so on and so forth. But these enforcement mechanisms then help in tamping down on that. Like for Facebook, I can say like in 2018 we took down in excess of 12 million pieces of terrorist content in first quarter of this year itself, and I think the latest numbers are yet to be released because we are constantly improving our AI tools, etc. We've been able to take down in excess of 6.1 million pieces of terrorist content. Specifically coming back to Pulwama, we sort of all know how it was a dastardly attack and caught everybody by surprise. But what we did is the moment it happened, we banked the last will video of the terrorist bomber, if you remember, when news channels were airing it, but we banked it. And essentially, we made sure that it did not have any place on our platforms. The second thing which we do is that, and I think other platforms do it also, but I can talk about what we do, we actively designate proscribed organizations on our platform. A lot of these proscribed organizations are running campaigns, right? In terms of known publicity channels, sources, we kind of look at them, and then we look at we sort of implement fan outs on our platform and actively purge these kind of organizations. So for example, AQIS, the Al-Qaeda Indian subcontinent, sort of the new group which has gained a lot of notoriety recently. Burhan Wani was a AQIS, sort of LET commander, also had affiliation with AQIS, etc. So for instance, we will not give actors like those a voice on our platform. They are actively enforced again. So in a nutshell, on Pulwama, we worked very actively with the appropriate agencies when the terrorist attack happened to make sure that we were disclosing basic subscriber information and other types of metadata, which had implications with the terrorist attack itself. We made sure that material which could potentially become active recruitment material was taken down from our platform.
Very interesting, and I want to take this to Sumaya because, you know, in the age of social media potentially being weaponized by terror groups, very detailed articulation from Anki Das on what Facebook did to take this kind of content down, but you actually study what happens when you go offline. What actually, you know, is the making, in a sense, of a terrorist's mind, of a terrorist's brain, and does this cutting the sort of umbilical cord between between publicity and amplification and having a platform to almost exhibit that violent streak. Is there a correlation in your research between taking that away and the violence itself?
Yeah, so it's a great point that both Anki and Kanishk mentioned, and I do agree that taking down of violent videos such as what happened in the Christchurch is important. But at the same time, these acts of terror have existed throughout the history. And my work essentially, not just in the lab that I work when it comes to neuroscience or pathophysiology of what happens in people who engage in violent behavior, but outside of it, when I've been speaking with people who've been former jihadis and former Nazis, they've all been doing this since a long period of time, and this has existed. And if not the platform, and I'm not saying that the platform shouldn't control it, it absolutely should. But the audience is there, and the audience has remained. For example, when the 9/11 happened, people had news, people had other media outlets to kind of look through what has happened, and that itself is there. And you know, and I agree that sometimes the extremists or the behavior of the extremists actually shown as highlighted as something to kind of achieve and look forward to. But at the same time, people who have grievances, people who have ideologies, or even people who don't have ideologies and are primed to violent behavior will engage in violent behavior regardless of the availability of social media. And that's something that we're not able to kind of tease apart. So we're talking about, yes, social media can definitely radicalize individuals, but at the same time, there's people who will engage in violent behavior because of that radicalization. And I would say there's a very small percentage of those radicals who will engage in violent behavior and engage in terrorism, and sometimes...
So you, sorry to interject, but I know we were discussing this off stage, that you want to draw a distinction between violence, terrorism, and radicals. So could you just elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So we have people looking at these videos, content online, and being radicalized, and people offline being radicalized through, peer-to-peer radicalization, propaganda that is just on print. And then there is terrorism, the people enabling violent actions of terrorism. And you could be a part of ISIS and not engage in violent behavior. And you're still a terrorist, but you're not engaging in violent behavior. Whereas what I do, particularly in my lab research, is what makes those people violent and how different they are from terrorists and radicals. Because everything that we're doing in terms of action, actionable behavior, such as aggression or violent aggression, is measured in the brain. And that is emotion processing, fear conditioning, regulation of fear memories, for example, and reward. Because all of this kind of adds to reward. People, blowing up, shooting. Other people are looking at this as a rewarding type of motivational driving violence, which is completely different to the retaliatory violence that people see on the streets. It's not a tit-for-tat violence. They're engaging in this with people who they have no connections with. So huge distinction again.
So it is actually very complex, and there is no one sort of quick fix solution. Victoria, you in specific look at fake news, and one of the things in your slide, it really stayed with me. It said content can kill. Can you explain that?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Victoria Lormanyuk. I'm representative Stop Fake project from Ukraine, from Kiev. I would like to tell you today about Stop Fake experience and the challenges of disinformation for Ukraine. When content kill. For the last 5 years, this problem has been very urgent and very important for our country. At the beginning of March 2014, when Russia troops in uniform without insignia took control in Crimea, many Ukrainians searched internet for the latest news. The information space of Russia, Ukrainian, and the rest of the world was flooded with deceitful messages from Russia and pro-Russia media that began to write about unconstitutional group in Ukraine, about activities of junta, about legitimacy President Yanukovych, and about role of United States and European Union in our revolution. And it was time when world fake started to become commonplace. And looking through social media, many Ukrainians were shocked, was surprised to see lack the information about event in Crimea that led to the illegal annexation in Crimea. And at the beginning of March 2014, we created our project, Stop Fake website. It was initiated by Mohila School of Journalism, students, lecture graduates, and later another editors, IT specialists, and translators joined this project. And the main objectives of Stop Fake team was to prove that Russian propaganda is systematic approach of Russian government, and systematic approach. It's a main point for me. The Stop Fake team not only reviewed fakes, but also we created propaganda archive and beta dice, analyze different fakes and narratives of propaganda. We have a lot of examples, different fakes, when Russia says that Ukrainian is fascist state, false state. It fakes about Ukrainian volunteers and army. There are maybe 20 narratives, Russia propaganda.
Can I just step in there and actually, because you've given us a food for thought for a next round of questions, which is that in this battle between Russia and Ukraine, you're saying that there's a lot of Russian government-backed propaganda that you see as fake news. I'm intrigued to understand what happens when there are competing narratives and who is the arbiter of what is objectively accurate. Some things are very obvious. Kanishk, do you want to take that? What happens when you don't know for sure what is fake and what is true?
Yeah, so I think, bringing back the Christchurch context, we saw a lot of these radicalized, inspirational terrorism operations work in the same way. Influence is a word to be coined here in the sense that a lot of the disinformation does not radicalize people. It's just simple, basic, engagement of the ideology itself. So we're talking about, we're talking about spectrums. We're talking about, a person who has a far-right ideology can suddenly subscribe to an extreme right ideology. We've seen in the case of the Christchurch Call shooter, who actually started off, if you look at a lot of his background data, as a far-right person who had anti-immigration views, xenophobic views, racist views, but then he suddenly found a micro-community online which wants to talk about more extreme parts of this view and want to amplify this view. So then also comes to the understanding, if we're seeing a lot of these narratives becoming mainstream now, normalizing the content on the internet, I think takedown comes as an essential part of these, as an approach. And so that's why we need to understand when we're talking about different narratives, we're talking about different influence operations, it's important that we understand that we social media companies work as a coalition together to stand up against these extreme online, conservative views. Because as it's the Christchurch incident itself represents a position that is conservative by the standards of some national governments, I think. It's not something that, someone can subscribe to a view and be like, it is a normal view.
Yeah. Anki, social media networks and platforms like Facebook now have fact-checking, collaborations, partnerships, and that's become a very important part of what you do. But when we live in such a polarized, volatile world, argumentative India as it is, how does a platform, obviously taking down something is the last thing a platform wants to do. What actually determines that decision for you?
So, in terms of looking at, first of all, identification of fake news and then taking appropriate enforcement action against that, I do want to unpack some of that, right? So, first of all, like I said, the biggest problem is the volume itself, right? Like in terms of if something is going badly viral and it is fake news, what do you do? So, there are different strategies which are adopted in terms of tackling with that on Facebook. There's a different strategy which is adopted to tackle that on WhatsApp, because these are two different services. One is a peer-to-peer messaging service, the other is a social media platform. But coming back to social media platforms, we have a multi-pronged strategy in terms of looking at enforcement against fake news. And this is just not limited to the type of Christchurch Call to action type of instances, which is very purely, dangerous speech, which has a real nexus to harm, real world violence. Obviously, it is going to have a certain texture of enforcement, which is very clearly laid out, which I covered earlier, which is the ad sharing project and the terrorist content enforcement, which we do. But insofar as fake news is concerned, we work actively with third-party fact checkers. These are people who are experts in the domain of fact checking, because we are a technology platform. We don't know how to fact check, sort of fake news which is going viral. So what happens is that when we have reporting buttons on every piece of content on Facebook, and when you report that to us, or if our fact checker sees something, is brought to the notice of our fact checker that something is a piece of content which is fake news, it would then make it to the queues, which our fact checkers would then review it, and then they would rank it as fake news. What happens as a consequence of that is that gets demoted, which essentially that means that discovery becomes difficult. You see almost a 80 to 90% reduction of that particular piece of content, which can otherwise go viral. So effectively, you kill distribution, right, in terms of just sanctioning that piece of fact-checked content. So it goes into that repository. On the WhatsApp side, we announced a range of product changes, limiting forwards to 5, right? You can't forward it for more than 5 times. We killed the fast forward on the video media, on any media forwards. We sort of killed that. We made sure that there were restrictions which were imposed in terms of adding somebody to a group who was not on your phone list, right? Like if you've gone and the consent aspect became very important in terms of you opting in as a user to make sure that you're limiting out sort of unwarranted solicitation of group additions, etc. So these are the range of product measures which we have taken to enforce against that. And the most important thing, this requires a huge degree of public inoculation. So we ran and we continually run public service announcements in terms of just making sure that people understand how to spot fake news, etc. We work with a variety of civil society organizations which have also local linguistic capabilities, because linguistic nuance is another aspect which is very important, at least in India, and also in other countries. I would imagine is the same thing over there. But just making sure that you're working with local experts and local community experts is super important in these areas.
Okay, Victoria, you want to quickly add to that, and then Mariam?
Yes. Our colleague from Ukrainian Crisis Media Center representative researches, according to which approximately 1/3 of all news and political talk show on Russia top 3 channel are dedicated to Ukraine, and 90% of coverage has been negative. It is not aggressive context, but it is disinformation, it is joke, it is hate speech, and 30,000 Ukrainians was killed in the world in eastern part of Ukraine because this hate speech.
Yeah. Mariam, 2 things here. One, your battle to get this taken seriously in Afghanistan, you were sharing that with me, that people just actually don't understand how high the stakes are. Not everybody still gets it. And, your own personal experience, having seen what the virality of something that shouldn't be going viral, the real life impact of it.
So in Afghanistan, how to use the internet hasn't been, the public hasn't been educated on it. So we have internet packages provided by telecommunication company. Majority of the Afghan public use their internet via phone, and their internet package consists of WhatsApp and Facebook. So many of these people use Facebook as a search engine. So that's one dangerous aspect. The second dangerous aspect is awareness. As much as I can appreciate what Twitter and Facebook is doing to bring this type of awareness, Afghanistan's population is not as educated, especially when it comes to English content. And I know that many of them do provide this information in the national language, but the attention span is not quite there in Afghanistan for them to read through the relevant context. Now, we talked about this earlier. There was a female named Farkhunda about 4 or 5 years ago. She was killed by a mob of young boys, and about 100 others were videotaping, and while thousands were watching her being stoned, run over by a car, and then burned to death. Now, this was being viraled, and I had immediately sent it. At that time, I was employed at the Office of the National Security Council, and I sent it to all the leadership, and many of them were at shock, and they didn't know how to control the content. And aside from controlling the content, the Afghan National Police Forces actually arrived late, and they weren't able to save the girl. So the fact that we are not as prepared, and I do not want to criticize the Afghan government, because the Afghan National Defense Security Forces are fighting so many battles, which is why I find that regional countries have a responsibility to also participate and effectively support Afghanistan in this field, because we are fighting terrorists on the front lines, we are fighting criminal activity, and we have so much fraction within the institutions that there is not as much support that could be provided. So as a region, if we don't come out effectively, because whatever happens in Afghanistan will also affect what happens in India, what happens in Pakistan, what happens in other regional countries. And I think that we need to have a call for humanity and be more effective on our social media use. One of the concerns that I mainly have is the use. And I think all of us can be more effective in this on how to use the internet. I know many of us have I, for instance, have been a victim of trolling, and then there's another term I use. What? Doxing in Afghanistan. And I don't think that people understand how dangerous that this can be when you realize that there's a life on the line.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, but I want to just flip it around, because we're pushing ourselves to think harder. And Sumaya, as a journalist, my question would be, what is that line between taking down something of the kind of video that Mariam just described, but also not sanitizing it? So for example, sometimes you need to jolt people out of their comfort that this is happening to women, that this is happening to maybe helpless people. And I'm very intrigued to understand from you a kind of neuroscience prism on this, that is it normalization when we see more violence, or is it sanitization to completely take away what's actually happening in the real world?
Right. Well, it really depends what group you belong to. If someone that you associate with is the one conducting that action of terrorism or violence, and you actually sympathize with that, or you think that you're in the same victim group with them, then it changes completely. And that, even if the video is not promoting it in a good way, the person will perceive it that way. And I think one of the biggest concerns here is that we're talking about taking down information, we're talking about controlling social media, but the whole point of this is that we should be preventing violence. And while we're putting so much energy and resources in trying to understand how we can control information, we're actually not even thinking about how or why we're making violent individuals in the society, and how we can measure them, and how we can actually, so what their grievances are and why they're doing it, but also, how it can be reliably understood using evidence-based practices. One of the biggest problems that I've had is that psychology, anthropology, political science, you name it, everything that goes into terrorism research right now hasn't been able to reliably produce correlates And profiling when it comes to radicals is an absolute mess. You can be economically safe, you can be from any social political background, any religion, even without an ideology, you can still be violent, whether it's shooting, lynching, bombing. You can have all of that and still be violent. And what we're producing is violent individuals. And the focus should be where you can reliably study those people. And I'm not even talking about how we can cure them. That is just a far-reach approach. We should understand why this is happening. And then, yes, control of media is just a second side to it. Probably a very small aspect, because you can still have these people around us without, any of this.
Are you saying the emphasis is wrong? Are you saying the emphasis on this content on online platforms is the wrong emphasis?
No, I think there is a huge imbalance on the emphasis. The imbalance is here because people who study this kind of stuff, when, not just in neuroscience, but in any biological aspects, they can reliably measure these things in the brain using genetics, using other types of physiology, is that I can count them on my fingers. These are the number of researchers that exist in this world who are doing the stuff that I am doing. I think this is the most important thing. We have terrorism researchers in every arena, but what are they measuring? Are they really measuring violent behavior? And if that's a no, then we're really failing at this.
Fascinating. But here, Kanishk, another question in the mix is what happens to free speech. That's a big emphasis in the Christchurch Call to Action. The United States, because of its First Amendment, didn't actually come on board as a government, though it said it backed the essence of the call to action. How do we reconcile these?
So I think by and large, if you talk about international bodies, Christchurch incident was recognized as an extreme incident itself. And
Yeah, I didn't mean Christchurch was a free speech debate. I'm saying now when we look ahead, we are talking about a free and secure internet, but the word free is still there. And therefore we have to focus a little bit on that too.
yeah, so by and large, if you talk about internet and free speech, internet by design itself means it guarantees a lot of rights to individuals in that sense. I mean, even if platform takes down content, people can still post their content relevant to other platforms. I think a lot of platforms are hosting free speech content online. And the main aspect here is to understand how do we balance the spectrum between an extreme content to other aspect of where do we draw the line between free speech? Because a lot of these, the neo-Nazi views and, a lot of these extreme views, people do carry the sort of sentiment that it's a part of the free speech, and this is how the platform should regulate itself, because by and large, the tech company started off as independent to the idea of, curbing down or doing takedowns. But then when these takedowns become inspirational terrorism, then we need to think about it, because coming back to the Christchurch reference, because that was one of the inspirational terrorism which actually led to El Paso shooting as well, where we saw El Paso person was inspired by that incident. The Christchurch shooter actually said subscribe to PewDiePie. PewDiePie is a YouTuber. If we talk about normalizing all of this content under the banner of free speech, then we need to draw lines. What is an extreme content and what comes under as a balanced far-right view as an ideology?
Okay, we have about 15 minutes. Let me open this up for questions from the floor, and then we can take concluding remarks from the panel. Question? Yes, at the back there. Please stand up so we can get a mic to you. Yeah, hi there. Yes, sir, saw you. Is there a mic on the floor? Oh, it's there? Okay, we'll start with you, and could you please go to that mic? We'll start with you while you have the mic. Yeah, please, just ask your question.
Okay, my question is, say the way I see it, fake news, the term fake is very loosely used. And if you look at it, any news media in the world, I mean, every single news media in the world is fake news. Without exception, because I'm yet to find a news media which gives the true message. I mean, in fact, truth is also, so it's a binary thing. So what happens is that everyone has a narrative. So my question is, to counter loosely mentioned, with different degrees of fakeness, by having more open channel of communications. Let's have gazillion different narratives and let the user decide which one they want to to listen to or watch. Because countering fake news or different degrees of fake news by putting some kind of censorship is not the answer.
So I let maybe someone from the panel take this, but I think narratives are not what's being taken down, and confirmation biases is something that everybody seeks in content that they consume. Anki, the difference between narratives being taken down and actual fake news, disinformation being taken down.
Yeah, so I think what companies and platforms are focusing on is not prevention, because you can't prevent it, because people will always produce fake news, but harm limitation is something which platforms are focused on. We need to distinguish between opinion, and that exists, Barkha, and that is really the narrative piece, which you talked about. And of course, this is something which is happening a lot in your industry, which is a media industry, and which is a legitimate activity and which should exist, and the different shades of opinion over there. That is not being fact-checked. The role of the fact-checking program is not to fact-check opinion, because that is within the preserve of free speech. I think there are very clear criteria of what is fake news, what is fake news, what is patently fake news, which can be identified by credible fact checkers. Now these fact checkers are sort of certified by the IFCN, which is the International Fact-Checking Network. It's a global body, which is a certification body, which has an appropriate amount of rigor and quality in terms of awarding these certifications. You can't just suddenly one day decide that, okay, I'm going to become a fact checker and I'm going to start fact-checking news. You have to have some basis in terms of having that kind of a certification. It's like a standard of review which you have to go through in order to qualify. That makes you a fact checker when you can offer yourself up as a fact checker to various platforms, because platforms don't have that capacity for sure. But I do want to make sure that that is something, that fine element is understood. And the second thing is that, look, misinformation, nexus to violence, the nexus to harm of the type which is a central theme of this panel, that in a sense is a binary, because you would know what is that kind of speech which is harm causing, and the nexus to violence in that is so apparent, like the Christchurch Call was, which is again what we are discussing over here. It sort of recognizes tensions, the conflation with opinion, for example, which is why the call very clearly laid down 5 individual actions and 4 collaborative actions, right, which included that even smaller platforms, it included an obligation even on smaller platforms to have a terms of service, reporting mechanisms, all of this, right, which are inbuilt as a governance practice for a lot of the internet platforms.
Okay, next question. She's already there, sir.
Can I just add on to this, ma'am?
Just wait, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question, I'll make it really brief, is for Sumaya, the social neuroscientist.
Sumaya, yeah.
Sumaya. So first of all, I'm a PhD candidate and I'm studying cognition. So I'm a cognitive scientist. So my question is, you seem to locate the idea, a lot of the behaviors you were describing, like the tendency to criminality or all sorts of problems that are caused by social, into the individual brain, into something that can be measured by brain waves or neural interactions or whatever. But whereas I'd say over 95 or whatever, most neuroscientists would agree that those behaviors, in fact, any behavior is not something simply you can locate in the brain or on the individual. It's an interaction of your context, your background, your socio-economical backgrounds, your neighborhood, the interaction you have with other people. So don't you think your oversimplification of behaviors into the individual
so it's the
problem, isn't that a problem that forces further to isolate and to cause more troubles for individuals?
It's the old nurture versus nature debate applied in a different way. Would you like to respond to that? Yes.
Yeah, so no, I absolutely agree that it is oversimplification. But what we're doing is we're not just measuring this in the brain. I think it is a layman's or a popular scientist's view to say that this is just something that is measured in the brain. We're using physiology, we're using genetics, we're doing a lot of, I would say it is neurobiology and not just brain imaging per se of this behavior. But at the same time, when I'm not doing just brain imaging, or people such as the kind of research that we do, we're doing functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is completely different. We're actually making people in the scanner, we're making them, do specific tasks that activates different types of physiology, which actually correlates with their behavior, and then there's a genetic basis to it. Of course, something that like this cannot be ignored, that you have environmental impact. An environment can be anything, from your socioeconomic background, from the political ideology, from your other types of grievances that you've had. But to ignore something like biology, which is a primary kind of a primer to start, someone who is extremely violent in particular, is a big mistake that we're doing.
Okay, question that side. Yeah.
So I'm Colonel Anand, and basically we too have the similar problems in the army. We have too much of information, and secondly, we have to also factor in how the person who's on the other end is receiving this. So even if you're just pushing the facts, that's not what you actually want to do. You want to actually get a particular effect from this information. So right now what's happening is you have this broadcast form of this thing, propagation, which is not really suitable in today's world, because people are really connected, and so there has to be some kind of an interface between the world and you. So for example, if you look at news channels, so you have Barkha that's talking about something, and then you have Arnav Goswami talking about something else. So a whole lot of, there are 20 channels. So people are spending their entire life, listening to all of this and trying to sift through information. But I would rather have an AI platform in between, actually listening to all of them and then telling me what is right and what is wrong. Because AI platform has a better, capacity to sift through information.
Fact from fiction and opinion
both
from
empirical,
facts.
both inductive and the deductive processes are much better in an AI platform.
It's actually
That
a
would
really interesting
actually be
question. May I just ask you to elaborate on one point? A very interesting comment you made was that in today's time, the broadcast platform doesn't work,
Yeah.
because everybody's just consuming content on this. There is a much more intimate relationship between a consumer and content today. Would you like to elaborate on how that is creating a problem for, or a challenge for the military? And I'll get the panel to respond.
Yeah, so basically if you look at security, and if you look at even the military platform, and the environment in which we operate, we have to actually push in the right information to the right kind of people. And that's happening within the companies. If you look at Cisco and all that, the employees get personalized messages. So they don't have a broadcast form of the same message where they have to actually sift through this and try to mine data out of it and try to make sense of it. But it is intuitive. So your platform, your television has to be intuitive to push information in that particular format. And what's actually driving this is an AI platform, which is actually trying to consume data and trying to see, because it also understands the user. So it not only understands the fact, but it also understands the user. And it tries to push information in that format to that particular user. So that customization is what is missing. So it's a technological problem, and I think we need to actually understand how to put this technology in place and fix it into the internet.
Well, I think it's really a fascinating question, and if anyone would like to take it, because I think what I'm really hearing Colonel Anand say is that you're in a post-broadcast information age, and you need a mediated interface in an age of fake news. But are algorithms the answer? Do algorithms contain the answer of giving you? So, Maya, you wanted to jump in there?
I do. I don't have an answer to your question, but I have a question to the question. Who decides, and where is the consensus of who decides how the algorithm is going to be framed?
Yeah. So the comparison is, the problem is the cognitive limitations of the human mind, right? So we have this midbrain, which is the emotional brain, which is actually subduing your prefrontal cortex. But if you look at AI platforms are absolutely, it's just pure prefrontal cortex. You don't have the emotional content. You don't have the amygdala along with it. So, and it also can sift through a lot of data. What you cannot do that. And so this logical resolution is much faster and better in a machine rather than you yourself. So you get bias. For example, like I was making a platform, a remote presence platform for the ICUs. So you always have a different, you have this problem of how do you customize. If you want to make a platform for a South Indian, let's say there's this ICU, robotic nurse, and this guy asks him, okay, what has happened to my wife? Probably the wife is dead after an accident. And if the nurse tells him the truth, he's going to have a heart attack. But if you have a Russian or probably a Sardar, okay, so he can handle the truth much better. in that
Lots
sense.
of assumptions.
So I'm just giving a humorous example.
So,
but the problem is, human brain is not really evolved enough to actually sit.
So the gist of what you're saying, and I do want someone to take it because we haven't actually answered his question, is that the human brain is capable of bias, but technology is more factual. The algorithm is to be trusted more than the person. Kanishk, would you like to come in on that? Yeah.
So I think the part of the algorithm.
Just speak closer into it. Yeah.
So I think the part of the algorithm is a big question here, because when you're talking about algorithms, you're talking about data basically. So you mean when you want to frame an algorithm for, in a sense of customization, you also want to rely on what sort of data set you're training that algorithm.
I think there is a misnomer there. It's not just data. That's the whole problem. Data is just coming.
Okay, we have to move on. Sorry.
Welcome to the panel.
Let's park this there and take the next question. Yeah. I have only 8 minutes left. So come on.
My question is regarding the definition of the term terrorism. Since we do not have an internationally accepted definition of the term terrorism, so we finally resort to the domestic laws in this regard. Now, the moment we resort to domestic law, and what we have seen is the rise of the authoritarian regimes all over the world, this definition can be taken as a resort by the authoritarian regimes to finally delegitimize even fundamental questions pertaining to self-determination, pertaining to many other fundamental rights.
So let me put that to the panel. I think we've already established that there are very clear definitions. Otherwise, there would not be an agreement between so many countries. If anyone, Mariam, do you want to quickly take that there is no universal definition of terrorism?
There's not a universal definition, which is why I say national terrorists, regional terrorists, international terrorism. So I don't know what your question poses, but
no, his question is, will it lead to a clampdown of communication? But I think that Christchurch and Germany are good examples of moments on which there is no difference of opinion. Okay, quickly here. Yes. I'm sorry, there's no mic. If you could just scream your question out. Sorry. Anki.
When it comes to peace negotiation with Taliban, and there were hundreds fake accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and social media that there were Taliban, and they were promoting like we are coming back and we will take the country and we will kill girls and everything. But there wasn't any single action against those fake accounts. And you know that if Trump suddenly somehow didn't decided that he is not going to talk with the Taliban in Camp David, then nation were ready to give up. It was part of this big decision was also that social media was a kind of big propaganda, especially Facebook and Twitter were big propagandas for Taliban and terrorist like groups. What is your kind of
rule and regulations for Afghanistan, because whatever happened to Afghanistan will affect everybody around.
Yeah, so we have global community standards. Our community standards are universal in application insofar as zero tolerance towards fake accounts are concerned, and we report this routinely in our transparency report in terms of the number of fake accounts we take down globally. In 2018, we reported that we've took down close to 1 billion fake accounts on our platform, right? Like we are a platform which has close to 2 billion users. Facebook as a platform is based on authentic identity. I cannot be, for example, Jane on Facebook, right? Because the way the system works is that if I and Barkha are friends in real life, we will know people between us. That creates a social graph, right? Like Facebook has a social graph. Typically, if you are a fake account, the fake account would have typical characteristics like there would be limitation in terms of common friends, there would be like a fake graph, there would be absence of a social graph, etc., which is like one of the distinguishing factors of a fake account. Plus, also our community is our best watchdog. They report accounts to us and problematic content to us all the time, which then get examined by our reviewers, as well as our algorithmic tools are also reviewing these kind of problematic features or characters. In addition, for Afghanistan, we specifically have built capacity in terms of Dari and Pashto, because there was feedback from groups like Technician and others, people who work on the ground in your country who've given us feedback, and based on that, we have developed those type of linguistic capacity as well.
Okay, last question. Yes, here. Yeah, just behind you. Yes, please.
Me. Oh, thank you. My question is to Agni, but it's based on Victoria's statement. You know, in cultures where jokes, statements are thrown all over the show, which impact fake news, but when you report that to Facebook, it's not taken down, because according to Facebook, it's not terrorism, it's not fake news. What are you guys doing in that time? Because look at what she made about her country.
I think you're saying that your experience of reporting, there are categories of behavior that don't exist. Like when they try to report something to be taken down, the response is often that it's neither terrorism nor...
Yeah, because the definition of fake news, according to what you've been saying, and what Victoria said, that the fake news that's spreading against around Russia, it's simple jokes, it's based on the culture. People are making simple jokes, and that end up killing people. So I want to find out what Facebook is doing about that, because it can start as a small thing, and it becomes a big thing, and affect lots of people, and I think that is influenced by cultures. So when we report as outsiders that this is a fake news, how does Facebook decide that? Because it's all based on what fact checkers are saying.
So which is why, you know, in terms of fake news, we don't want to be the arbiters of truth, which is why we work with fact checkers who we assume are experts in this area because they are internationally certified. They also have local, context. For example, we have fact checkers in Sri Lanka, we have fact checkers in India, we've got about 7 to 8 of them who are fact checkers over here. But I think you raised a very interesting question, is that there may be some, which is why this is very hard, right? Like detection of fake news and enforcement against it is not easy. Your point is that when there's satire, there is no automatic detection of satire as fake news. And then what do? I honestly haven't studied that area in great deal to be able to give you a response, but it definitely is a very interesting factoid which you have revealed today. I don't have an immediate answer for you, but in terms of what would we do to if satire were to be fake news, and you don't know how it will land. But look, our view is that we would expect our fact-checking organizations to be able to double-click on that and sort of advise us appropriately in terms of whether this itself is fake news and therefore needs to be demoted according to our product sanctions which we have.
Okay, Victoria, quickly, I'm just at the end now.
It is a very difficult question because it is very difficult to know. It is another point of view or propaganda, and in Facebook, I think it's really very difficult. In my opinion, we need to review approach to using information and work hard to develop critical thinking. And for our audience and professional environment, it is very important for us.
Okay, we've got 15 seconds left. I think it's just enough time to say thank you for a fascinating, complex conversation. And I think we did cover many shades of opinion here. An important beginning has been made with the Christchurch Call to Action. We saw the results of it in Germany, and may this dialogue continue. Thank you. A big round of applause for our panel, and to you for being an engaged audience.